for 4 seasons in the early 1970s, 30 million Americans invited a girl named Lori Partridge into their living rooms every Friday night. She sat behind a keyboard on a psychedelic school bus, harmonized with her television brothers and sister, and smiled the kind of smile that ended up taped inside a million teenage lockers. To the country, she was proof that a family could be loud, musical, and completely wholesome all at once. But the young woman playing her, Susan Dey, was carrying something the cameras never showed. Behind the songs and the laugh track was a girl who had lost her mother at 8 years old, who was quietly starving herself to fit a network's idea of a teenage star, and who would spend the next 3 decades building a second, much quieter self that almost nobody got to see. This is the story of the distance between Lori Partridge and the real woman who played her, and why, when the fame finally became too loud, Susan Dey chose to walk away from it entirely. Susan Dey was born on December 10, 1952, in the small town of Pekin, Illinois. Her father, Robert Smith Dey, and her mother, Ruth Pyle Dey, a nurse, raised their children in an ordinary, working household, far from anything resembling show business. There was no reason in those early years to think that a girl from Pekin would end up on magazine covers across the country. Then, when Susan was 8 years old, her mother died. It was the first fracture in a childhood that had, up to that point, looked unremarkable, and it left a mark that would surface again and again over the following decades, long after the cameras started rolling. After her mother's death, the family eventually relocated, and Susan's father remarried a woman named Gail. It was Gail who first noticed something in her stepdaughter that Susan herself hadn't yet recognized, a natural photogenic quality that seemed suited for more than a family photo album. Around 1968, when Susan was about 15, Gail sent a photo of her to a modeling agency in New York. It was a small, almost incidental decision that would end up redirecting the entire course of Susan's life. She began modeling as a teenager, picking up magazine work and small print jobs, including an early assignment illustrating a booklet aimed at teaching young girls about puberty. It wasn't glamorous work, but it put her in front of casting directors, and it gave a shy Midwestern teenager her first real taste of being looked at by strangers. That taste turned into something much larger in 1970. Susan, only 17 at the time and with no acting training or experience whatsoever, auditioned for a new ABC musical sitcom about a widowed mother and her 5 children who form a pop band. The part was Lori Partridge, the sensible, keyboard-playing eldest daughter. Against steep odds, a teenager with zero on-camera experience beating out trained young actresses, Susan won the role. The Partridge Family premiered that September, and almost overnight, the show became a genuine cultural phenomenon. It produced hit records, sold out concert tours for its in-house band, and made overnight teen idols out of its 2 oldest cast members, Susan and her co-star David Cassidy. Susan's face was suddenly everywhere, on posters in teen magazines and on merchandise sold in department stores across the country. What the cameras couldn't capture was what that kind of overnight fame does to a teenager who is still functionally a kid. Years later, speaking to the Washington Post about that period of her life, Dey described the strange psychological trap of being treated as an adult celebrity while still being legally and emotionally a minor, old enough to be idolized, but nowhere near old enough to understand what that idolization would cost her. That cost showed up first, and most dangerously, in her relationship with her own body. During the run of the Partridge Family, Dey developed an eating disorder, a fact she has confirmed in her own words in later interviews. The pressures of 1970s network television, which prized a very specific, very thin ideal of teenage femininity, collided with a girl who was still working through grief and a total lack of privacy, and something had to give. It gave in the form of an illness that she carried largely silently through some of the most publicly visible years of her life. While the exact details of her health during that period were never made public at the time, this was still an era when eating disorders were barely discussed at all, let alone by a teenage star under contract to a major network. Dey has since acknowledged the disorder directly, describing it as one of the real costs of a fame that arrived before she was ready for it. The show itself, meanwhile, kept climbing. Alongside the television series, the Partridge Family Band released real albums and singles that charted on the pop charts, turning the fictional group into an actual, commercially successful musical act. Susan, despite having no formal musical training, learned to play keyboard and sing well enough to front some of that material, absorbing an entirely new skill set in real time while filming a network show on a punishing schedule. In 1972, while the show was still airing, she made her feature film debut in the airplane thriller Skyjacked, sharing the screen with veteran star Charlton Heston, a significant vote of confidence from an industry that could easily have kept her boxed into teen television forever. That same year, she published a book aimed at teenage girls offering beauty and lifestyle advice, which became a commercial success and cemented her status as a role model for a generation of young fans who wanted to be like Lori Partridge, not just watch her. The Partridge Family ended its run in 1974 at the height of its popularity, a fairly unusual exit for a hit show and one that left both audiences and its young cast somewhat unmoored. For Susan, not yet 22 years old, this meant confronting a question that has ended plenty of young careers before and since. Who are you when the character that made you famous disappears from the air? She spent much of the mid to late 1970s trying to answer that question, and not always successfully. She took on more grown-up roles, including playing Jo March in a 1978 television adaptation of Little Women, and she reportedly turned down the role of Sandy in the film Grease, a decision that, in hindsight, says something about how deliberately she was trying to steer her own career rather than simply taking whatever came her way. Not every choice paid off. A 1977 sitcom called Loves Me Not was canceled after only a handful of episodes, a blunt reminder that the goodwill built by a hit show doesn't automatically transfer to whatever comes next. But that same year, she also delivered a well-reviewed dramatic performance in the television film Mary Jane Harper Cried Last Night, playing a young mother experiencing a psychological breakdown, a world away from Lori Partridge's sunny cheerfulness, and a sign that there was a serious actress underneath the teen idol image, if anyone was willing to look for her. It would take nearly a decade and one particular role for the rest of the industry to really look. In 1986, Dey was cast as Grace Van Owen, a deputy district attorney who later becomes a judge, on the new NBC legal drama L.A. Law. The show, created by Stephen Bochco and Terry Louise Fisher, became one of the defining dramas of its decade, tackling issues like the aftermath of the Los Angeles riots, racism, gay rights, and sexual harassment inside a slick, ensemble legal setting. Grace Van Owen was not written as a supporting love interest. She was one of the show's central moral compasses, a sharp, principled woman navigating a legal system and a personal life that rarely made things easy for her. Dey played the role for 8 seasons, appearing in well over 100 episodes, more than she had ever appeared in as Lori Partridge. And the performance finally definitively broke the typecasting that had followed her since 1974. In 1988, she won the Golden Globe Award for Best Actress in a Television Drama Series, and she picked up 3 Emmy nominations across the show's run. Her character's influence extended beyond the screen, too. The soft, tailored business blouse Grace wore became something of a minor fashion trend among real working women in Southern California. And Dey later said that women had approached her over the years to say the character had influenced their decision to go to law school. Off camera, Dey was reportedly protective of what the role represented. She has spoken about pushing back against storylines that risked reducing Grace to a romantic subplot rather than a fully realized professional woman, insisting on a character who kept her own career and her own voice intact rather than existing primarily to be someone's love interest. Whether or not every detail of those behind-the-scenes negotiations has ever been made fully public, the on-screen result was unmistakable. Grace Van Owen is remembered today as one of the more substantial female characters of 1980s network television, precisely because the show refused to flatten her into a stock role. Dey continued working steadily through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, including a memorable guest appearance on Saturday Night Live that showed off a lighter, more comedic side of her that dramatic roles rarely allowed. Not every project landed. A sitcom called Love and War, which paired her with Jay Thomas and Tracy Ullman in the early 1990s, ended with Dey being written out after a handful of episodes, reportedly due to a mismatch in on-screen chemistry with her co-star, an unglamorous, fairly ordinary kind of Hollywood setback. but one that, by all accounts, she absorbed without much public drama. She moved instead toward heavier, more character-driven television films, including the 1993 drama Lies of the Heart, sometimes cited under related titles from the period, in which she played a pregnant woman struggling with addiction, a role that pushed her further from the wholesome Partridge family image than almost anything she had done before. Roles in television films like Bed of Lies and Deadly Love followed through the 1990s, none of them blockbusters, but each one part of a fairly consistent pattern. An actress who seemed less interested in chasing the biggest possible spotlight and more interested in taking parts that let her stretch. In 2002, Dey returned briefly to the character that had made her a star for a second time, appearing again as Grace Van Owen in an LA Law reunion television movie. It read less like an attempt to relive old glory and more like a deliberate, occasional check-in with a role she clearly still respected. Her final professional acting credit came in 2004, with a guest appearance as Dr. Susan Dey on the drama series Third Watch. There was no farewell tour, no retirement press conference, no dramatic public announcement that this was the end. She simply stopped taking roles. And after more than 3 decades in front of cameras, the public-facing half of Susan Dey's life quietly went dark. It's here that the real distance between the two halves of her life becomes clearest, not because of any hidden scandal, but because of just how completely she seemed to mean it when she said she was done. Since 2004, Dey has lived largely out of the public eye, eventually settling into a quieter life away from Los Angeles with her husband. She has consistently declined to participate in Partridge family reunion specials and retrospectives, a pattern noted publicly by her former television mother, Shirley Jones, in Jones's own 2013 memoir. Jones wrote that out of the entire original cast, Dey was the only one who had consistently refused to take part in any televised reunion of the show, including a widely publicized cast get-together on the Today Show in 2010, which Dey sat out entirely. Her former co-star Danny Bonaduce, who played her television brother Danny Partridge, has said in a recent interview that fame in general simply was not something Dey wanted, and that she had made a clear, ongoing choice to keep her life private in upstate New York rather than continuing to trade on a character she played as a teenager more than 50 years ago. That instinct toward privacy has extended to almost every part of her adult personal life, though the broad outlines are on the public record. In 1976, Dey married Leonard "Lenny" Hershen, a well-established Hollywood talent manager considerably older than she was, whose client list over the years included some of the biggest names in the industry. The two had a daughter together. Their marriage ended in divorce in 1981 after roughly 5 years together, without the kind of public scandal or acrimony that often accompanies celebrity divorces. By most accounts, it was simply two people whose lives and life stages had moved in different directions. In 1988, Dey married again, this time to television producer Bernard Safransky, a marriage that has now lasted for close to 4 decades and that appears, from the outside at least, to have provided exactly the kind of stability and privacy she had been quietly building toward for years. The couple has largely stayed out of the tabloid press, appearing together occasionally at charity events, but rarely commenting publicly on their relationship in any detail. The other relationship that has followed Dey through her public life, whether she wanted it to or not, is her connection to her Partridge family co-star David Cassidy. The two met as teenagers on the set of the show, playing on-screen siblings whose easy chemistry helped sell the illusion of a real family to millions of viewers. Off-screen, according to accounts that have surfaced over the years, including from Cassidy himself, Dey developed genuine feelings for Cassidy during their years working together, and the two did pursue some kind of relationship after production on the series wound down, though it did not last. In 1994, Cassidy published a memoir, Come On, Get Happy, in which he wrote about his years on the show, including his relationship history with several co-stars and acquaintances from that period of his life, Dey among them. The book's frank, tell-all tone was jarring to some who had known him only as the clean-cut teen idol of the early 1970s, and its publication meant that a private chapter of Dey's own life became, to at least some degree, public property, without her having chosen that exposure herself. There is no detailed public record of exactly how Day reacted to the book at the time, but her long-standing refusal to participate in any Partridge family reunions or retrospectives in the years since is, at minimum, consistent with someone who preferred to leave that entire chapter of her life in the past. When Cassidy died in 2017 at the age of 67, following complications from organ failure, Day did not make any public statement about his death, a silence that fits the same pattern of a woman who has spent 50 years declining to perform her feelings about that period of her life for an audience. If there is a through line connecting the various chapters of Day's private life, it may be this: a consistent, almost stubborn preference for quiet, chosen commitments over anything performed for public consumption. That preference shows up again in the one area where she has been willing to step, at least partially, back into public view: advocacy work. For years, Day has served as a board member of the Rape Treatment Center at UCLA Medical Center, an organization that supports survivors of sexual assault. She has co-narrated a documentary about campus sexual violence alongside her former LA Law co-star Corbin Burnson, using whatever residual public profile she still had, decades after her last acting credit, in service of an issue that clearly mattered to her more than maintaining her own celebrity. It's a strand of her life that gets relatively little attention compared to her television career, but by most accounts it has been a steady, long-running commitment rather than a one-off publicity appearance. In the years since she stepped away from acting, reporting on Day's life has painted a consistent picture: a woman who moved eventually to a small town in upstate New York with Safransky, where she has kept a low profile, engaged with local community life, and shown little interest in reconnecting with her old career. She does not maintain a public social media presence. She has not written a tell-all memoir of her own, despite decades of material that could easily have filled one. Neighbors who have spoken to reporters over the years describe an ordinary woman doing ordinary things, walking with her family, running errands, gardening, rather than anyone visibly performing the role of reclusive former star. That, in its own way, may be the most telling detail of all. After more than 3 decades of being watched, first as a beloved sitcom daughter, and then as an award-winning dramatic actress, Susan Dey appears to have built a life defined almost entirely by not being watched. Taken together, the two Susan Days that emerge from the public record are not the stuff of tabloid scandal, but they are genuinely distinct from one another. There is the Susan Dey who existed on screen and in magazine profiles: Lori Partridge, the sensible sitcom daughter. Then Grace Van Owen, the trailblazing television lawyer, a Golden Globe winner, a 3-time Emmy nominee, a fashion influence, a face that defined 2 different decades of American television. And there is the private Susan Dey, largely constructed out of small, consistent choices made away from cameras. The teenager quietly battling an eating disorder while smiling for photographers. The young woman who kept her feelings for a co-star mostly to herself until someone else's memoir put them into print. The actress who insisted her character be more than a love interest. The retiree who has spent 2 decades saying no to reunion specials and yes to advocacy work that gets far less attention. Neither version of her life was ever really hidden. Most of these facts are on the public record. In her own interviews, in Shirley Jones's memoir, in David Cassidy's book, in reporting on her advocacy work. But taken individually, in scattered interviews and old magazine clippings across 5 decades, they rarely get assembled into a single, complete picture. That's the sense in which Day lived something like a double life. Not a life of secrets and deception, but a life split cleanly down the middle between a public image that was carefully managed by a network and a studio system, and a private self that she has spent the back half of her life quietly, deliberately protecting. What makes her story worth revisiting now isn't scandal. There isn't one, despite how these kinds of retrospectives are often packaged. It's the unusually clear-eyed consistency of her choices. Most former child stars who step back from the industry do it gradually, often reluctantly, sometimes after the industry has stepped back from them first. Day, by most accounts, walked away deliberately, at a point when she could still have kept working, and then held that line for 2 decades without wavering, without cashing in on a nostalgia circuit that would have welcomed her back at any point. She turned down reunions that her former co-stars embraced. She let a memoir written by someone else define the public record of one of her most personal relationships, rather than responding with a book of her own. She used what remained of her public platform not to extend her own fame, but to support survivors of sexual assault through an organization she has stayed connected to for years. None of that reads like a woman running from something shameful. It reads like a woman who spent her adolescence and much of her 20s performing an idea of herself that a network had built, and who decided, once she finally had the power to choose, that she would rather not perform at all. Susan Dey turned 73 this past December. She has not acted in more than 20 years, has given vanishingly few interviews in that time, and appears to have no interest in changing that. For a generation of viewers, she will always be Lori Partridge, smiling from the top of a psychedelic tour bus, or Grace Van Owen, delivering closing arguments in a Los Angeles courtroom. Both of those women were real performances, built by a real actress with real talent. But somewhere underneath both of them was a quieter, more private person, a girl who lost her mother too young, who nearly lost herself to the pressure of being watched, and who eventually decided that the only role left worth playing was simply herself, off stage, out of frame, and finally left alone. End of script.